about Doge, Congresswoman LaMonica McIver says we are at war. Ilhan Omar says we might actually see somebody get killed.
A budget, it is a blueprint for American decline. Let's be clear. They want to exploit your labor.
Harris on prices.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you for that question. It's obviously an important one. The president campaigned on reigniting the Trump economy.
Have you ever seen a press secretary completely turn the tables on hostile reporters? Karoline Leavitt just did exactly that when confronted about Ilhan Omar, and the media had no idea what was coming. In a moment that left journalists speechless, Leavitt didn't just defend herself. She exposed a pattern of media protection that's been hiding in plain sight. The room went completely silent when she quoted Omar's own words back to the press corps, proving her point in real time as Omar appeared on MSNBC simultaneously. Before we move on, I'd like to ask you a small favor. If you appreciate this content, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Over 98% of you watch the videos without subscribing. It costs you nothing, but it makes a huge difference to us. So, did you click the subscribe button? Great, thank you so much. Now, back to the video. Ever wonder what happens when reporters think they've cornered someone only to become trapped themselves? That's exactly what happened when the press corps tried to ambush Karoline Leavitt. The scene was set perfectly. A packed press room, cameras rolling from every angle, journalists clutching their notepads filled with carefully crafted questions. You could practically feel the electricity in the air as reporters exchanged knowing glances, each one convinced they had the perfect question to make Leavitt stumble. The tension reached its peak when the first reporter's hand shot up.
And got your earned benefits, all to bankroll tax cuts for their wealthy friends and donors.
Fixing the mess that was created by the previous administration. We know they created an economic and an inflation nightmare for the American people.
Ms. Leavitt, can you explain your comments about Representative Omar? The question came from Peter Chen of CNN, his tone already accusatory. Other journalists leaned forward in their seats, recording devices extended, waiting for what they hoped would be a defensive stumble or an angry outburst they could splash across headlines by noon. The press corps' strategy was transparent to everyone watching. They weren't seeking information. They were setting a trap, force Leavitt to either defend controversial statements or create a juicy soundbite they could use against her. It was a tactic they'd perfected over years of briefings and one that had claimed many political casualties before. But what these seasoned reporters hadn't counted on was Leavitt's preparation. Without missing a beat, she reached for her iPad, unlocked it with a calm swipe, and turned to Peter. Before I answered, could you please tell me exactly what I said about Representative Omar that you're referring to? Her voice was steady, her expression neutral but expectant. The CNN reporter began to paraphrase, "Well, you implied that her comments were inciting." Leavitt cut him off politely but firmly. "I'm not asking what you think I implied. I'm asking you to quote what I actually said." The first cracks in the ambush began to show as Peter shuffled through his notes, unable to produce the exact quote he was so eager to condemn. The energy in the room shifted palpably. Several journalists who had been poised with follow-up questions suddenly became intensely interested in reviewing their notes. Others exchanged uneasy glances as they realized their usual tactics weren't working against someone who came armed with facts rather than rhetoric.
This proposal will only deepen the constitutional crisis we are already in. A president trying to rule like a dictator.
Our side of the aisle, from Republican leaders on Capitol Hill, I think there would be a lot more outrage in this room today. It's unacceptable.
When Peter finally offered a vague approximation of Leavitt's words, she simply turned her iPad around, displaying the transcript of her actual statement. "That's not what I said, Peter. Words matter in this business, especially when you're accusing someone of misrepresenting another's words." But Leavitt didn't stop there. She flipped the script entirely, addressing the entire press corps with a question of her own. I'd like to ask all of you something. Why does the phrase "fight in the streets" mean something entirely different depending on who says it? She paused, scanning the room. When certain politicians use those exact words, they're speaking metaphorically or using passionate rhetoric. When others use identical language, they're inciting violence or threatening democracy. Can anyone explain that disparity to me? The silence that followed was deafening. Cameras continued rolling, capturing the uncomfortable shifting and throat clearing as not a single reporter volunteered an answer. One journalist from NBC attempted to redirect, asking about inflation numbers instead, but Leavitt wasn't letting them off the hook.
And I'm not going to stand up here and lie to you like my predecessor did about the state of our economy. We understand there are people, comments that have been made by these Democrat leaders, and frankly, they don't even know what they're talking about. Because President Trump was elected with a mandate from—
I notice no one wants to answer my question, she observed, the hint of a smile playing at the corner of her mouth. Let me be more specific then. Representative Omar said, and I quote directly, "We might actually see somebody get killed. We have to fight this in the streets." If any Republican had said those exact words, what would your headlines look like tomorrow? Again, silence engulfed the room. A few reporters stared intently at their notepads. Others suddenly needed to check their phones. The trap designed for Leavitt had somehow closed around its creators instead. With practiced precision, Leavitt continued, "The American people aren't blind. They see the double standard. They notice when the same words are peace-loving activism from one politician and dangerous incitement from another." Her voice remained measured, but her words landed like precision strikes. As the first round of questions ended in uncomfortable silence, the usual buzzing energy that dominated press briefings was noticeably absent. Reporters who had arrived confident and aggressive now sat subdued, recalculating their approach. Some were already texting their editors, trying to figure out how to frame what had just happened. Just as the reporters were busy with their damage control texts, something extraordinary started happening in that press room. You could feel the shift in energy as phones began lighting up one by one. The hushed whispers and sideways glances told everyone something major was unfolding beyond the four walls of that briefing room. "Ms. Leavitt," called out a reporter from MSNBC, breaking the tense silence. "I think you should know that Representative Omar is currently live on Morning Joe discussing your comments right now."
Department of Government Efficiency, and the two of them, with a great team around them, were going to look at the receipts of this federal government and ensure it's—
An unelected billionaire using hate and fear to expand his control over our country?
The room erupted in murmurs. This wasn't just another press briefing anymore. This was turning into a real-time showdown happening across two television networks simultaneously. Instead of looking worried, Leavitt's expression remained composed, almost as if she'd been expecting this exact scenario. "What exactly is she saying?" Leavitt asked, her voice calm but firm. The reporter glanced down at his phone, scrolling through the live updates. "She's claiming that you're spreading lies to cover up for Trump's failures, and says you're deliberately putting people's lives at risk by mischaracterizing her words." The press corps watched Leavitt carefully, expecting to see defensiveness or maybe even anger. After all, being accused of endangering someone's life on national television isn't a small charge. But instead of retreating, Leavitt did something that caught everyone off guard. "Can someone play the clip of what she's saying right now? I think it's important we all hear it directly," she requested, gesturing to the monitors in the briefing room. Within moments, the screens flickered to life with a split-screen feed. Leavitt standing confidently at the podium on one side, and Omar speaking animatedly on Morning Joe on the other. The visual was striking. Two women engaged in a political battle, separated by networks, but connected by timing. "Yes, I was speaking metaphorically," Omar was saying to Joe Scarborough on the screen. "I was calling for people to stand up against this administration's attacks on our rights." Leavitt waited for the clip to finish playing before addressing the room again. The temperature seemed to rise as she pulled up her iPad. Unlike before, her demeanor had shifted slightly. Still professional, but with an intensity that hadn't been there earlier. "Noish, let me get this straight," Leavitt said, looking directly at the cameras. "Representative Omar is now claiming she was speaking metaphorically when she called for fighting in the streets. Let's refresh everyone's memory about what she actually said, word for word." She turned her iPad toward the press corps, showing the exact quote she had referenced earlier. The contrast between Omar's current explanation and her original words created a stunning dissonance that even the most seasoned reporters couldn't ignore. "I've shown you her exact words," Leavitt continued, her voice cutting through the silence. "Tell me, what part of that sounds metaphorical? At what point in that statement does she clarify she's speaking figuratively?" Not a single hand went up, not a single voice offered an explanation. The press corps, normally ready with a dozen follow-up questions, sat in uncomfortable silence. After giving them ample time to respond, Leavitt continued, "What we're witnessing right now is precisely the problem Americans are tired of. When certain politicians use phrases like fight in the streets, they get the benefit of claiming it was metaphorical. When others use similar language, they're accused of inciting violence." One of the reporters attempted to change the subject, raising his hand and beginning, "Ms. Leavitt, if we could move on to discuss the administration's economic policy." "We're not moving on just yet," Leavitt interrupted firmly. The determination in her voice made it clear she wasn't going to let this moment pass without making her point.
That are hurting. And this administration is wholeheartedly committed to ensuring that those individuals see relief, accountable to American taxpayers. That's all that is happening here. And for Democrat officials to incite violence and encourage Americans to take...
The American people deserve better than this obvious double standard. They deserve media that holds everyone to the same standard regardless of political affiliation. The reporter sank back into his seat, visibly uncomfortable. What we're seeing unfold right now is exactly the kind of media bias that undermines trust in journalism, Leavitt continued. Representative Omar makes inflammatory statements, then reframes them when convenient, and many in this room simply accept the new explanation without question. She gestured toward the screens where Omar had been speaking moments before. Meanwhile, other public figures have their words scrutinized, dissected, and often intentionally misrepresented to paint them in the worst possible light. As Leavitt spoke, several reporters shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some avoided eye contact altogether, suddenly finding their notepads fascinating. Others exchanged glances, unsure how to respond to being called out so directly. Those uncomfortable glances between reporters were about to transform into sheer panic. With the coolness of someone holding a royal flush at a high-stakes poker table, Leavitt reached for her iPad once more. The room fell into a hush as she swiped through to her next piece of evidence, the one that would leave no room for denial about what millions of Americans had suspected for years.
Congressional Republicans pretending this chaos is normal even as their own constituents call them out for their cowardice.
That are burdensome on their household and their businesses, and the president and this entire administration are focused on that every day.
"Let me show you something interesting," Leavitt announced, her voice steady yet commanding. She turned her iPad toward the cameras deliberately, making sure viewers at home could see exactly what she was about to reveal. "Here's how you covered Trump," she began, displaying a series of damning headlines from major news outlets. The bold text from CNN read, "Trump's violent rhetoric inspires insurrection." Next to it, a Washington Post headline declared, "Trump's words are a threat to democracy." Completing the trifecta was MSNBC's take, "Trump's dangerous speech sparks extremism." The reporters shifted in their seats, some looking down at their shoes, others pretending to take notes. But Leavitt wasn't finished. She swiped to the next screen. "And here's how you covered Omar," she continued, revealing a completely different set of headlines about the same type of inflammatory rhetoric. "Ilhan Omar calls for action on civil rights," read the CNN headline. "Omar's passionate speech highlights political divide," declared NBC. And finally, "Ilhan Omar urges Americans to fight for justice," from MSNBC. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Same actions, completely different framing. The visual evidence was devastating. Leavitt paused, letting the headlines speak for themselves for several long seconds. Then came the knockout punch. "Spot the difference?" she asked, her question hanging in the air like a guillotine blade. Not a single reporter rushed to answer. The silence in the room was deafening. One brave soul from the back row finally attempted to change the subject. "Ms. Leavitt, if we could move on to discuss the administration's economic policies."
Government is being hollowed out. Our institutions are falling apart. And today, House Republicans are slashing programs
To the streets is incredibly alarming, and they should be held accountable for that rhetoric.
It sounds like something that they're most concerned about.
Now that the Ilhan Omar scandal is blowing up on Twitter, you all suddenly want to pivot. Leavitt cut in, calling out the transparent attempt to escape accountability. The reporter immediately fell silent, caught in the act. Leavitt wasn't letting them off the hook that easily. This moment was too important. The American people were finally seeing with their own eyes how the media machine operates. What the American public is witnessing right now in real time is selective outrage, she continued, her gaze sweeping across the room. This isn't about what's right. It's not about truth. It's about who gets protected and who gets destroyed. The words landed like body blows. Several reporters looked physically uncomfortable now, squirming in their seats as if sitting on hot coals. The evidence was simply too clear to dismiss. The side-by-side headlines showed a pattern that couldn't be explained away as coincidence or editorial judgment. This wasn't just about Omar or Trump anymore. This was about exposing a system that had frustrated millions of Americans who had long suspected they weren't getting the straight story from major media outlets.
Ask my Republican colleagues, who will you serve? The people who sent you here or the billionaires trying to buy our democracy.
I can go through the very long list of economic actions this president has taken. I know you work for Bloomberg, so I'm sure you're well aware of them, but I can assure the American people that
The pattern was now displayed in black and white, impossible to ignore. What made this moment so powerful wasn't just Leavitt's prepared evidence, but the journalists' complete inability to defend themselves. They had been caught red-handed playing favorites with politicians based on party affiliation, rather than applying consistent standards. The room remained uncomfortably quiet. No follow-up questions, no challenges to her evidence, no attempts to justify the disparate coverage. Their silence spoke volumes about the validity of Leavitt's point. A few reporters exchanged nervous glances, others tapped urgently on their phones, perhaps warning their editors about what had just transpired or trying to figure out how to frame this confrontation in a way that wouldn't make them look terrible.